So this man defeated an entire army all by himself. Literally, this one guy, about 50 years old, alone, unarmed, with no physical training to speak of, and yet single-handedly defeated a massive army of around 150,000 soldiers. And interestingly, he achieved this by pretending to be weak, intentionally and strategically. This is the story of 空城计, or in English known as the empty fortress strategy. It's one of the most iconic stories in the romanticized version of Chinese history, one that's been studied and analyzed by scholars for centuries for what it can teach us about strategy and psychology and warfare. And I'm excited to share it with you today. Now, the story took place in the 200 CE. This was a period of extended civil war in China, which eventually stabilized into 3 different kingdoms, with each of them ultimately aiming to annihilate the others and gaining control over all of China. This is commonly referred to as the Three Kingdoms era in Chinese history, and it was quite a time to be alive. The man of the hour is named Zhuge Liang. He was serving as the chancellor of the Shu kingdom at the time. He had just led an army to attack the Wei kingdom, but lost. So Zhuge Liang was in the middle of retreating, and the situation was not looking good for him at all. As a result of his recent defeat, most of his soldiers died in the battle. His remaining forces mostly consist of wounded soldiers with low morale and were in no condition to fight another major battle. At the same time, his enemy was chasing after him with a massive army. While Zhuge Liang and his remaining forces were running away from their enemy, they arrived at a small town called Xicheng and decided to set up camp there. However, right after the camp was set up, Zhuge Liang received news that his enemy was catching up to them and were about to arrive at the front gate of the town. Zhuge Liang and his subordinates were obviously surprised by the speed at which the enemy was able to catch up to them, and upon hearing this bad news, many of the subordinates started saying, well, we're fucked. There's no way that our small and wounded forces can take on this entire army. This small town doesn't really have the infrastructure to defend against an entire army in the first place. Our enemy is going to storm the gates quite easily and breach our defenses like tofu and just kill us all. Right, let's just call our wives and text our kids and make our peace with the gods and do whatever else that people do before they die these days. But Zhuge Liang looked at the situation, thought for a moment, and goes, you know what, guys? Don't worry about this. I got you. Here's what I need. Get me one of those classical Chinese music instruments that makes me look mysterious and full of wisdom while playing. And get me a few servants to stand next to me while I play so I look like a pretentious asshole. And light up a few candles around me while you're at it. And this part is important. I want you to leave the city gate wide open and get a few soldiers to dress up as commoners and just have them sweep the floor in front of the gates, looking all casual and inconspicuous. And that's it. I want no weapons, no securities, no soldiers at all to man the gates, no military presence of any kind. Just stay in your tent with our troops and watch TV and play Xbox and just chill for a few hours and it will all be over. So by the time the enemy forces arrived at the front gate, they were visibly confused. The enemy knew that they were chasing after Zhuge Liang, who by then was a world-renowned strategist, famous for being smart and cautious while employing lethal military strategy. So the enemy was expecting a good fight. Right? They were getting ready for some real hard work of a proper attack on the city, and yet when they arrived, they saw no military presence of any kind. Instead, they saw the city gate wide open with some random dudes in the front just doing some casual cleaning. The enemy almost thought that they had got the wrong address, if not for the famous strategist himself, Zhuge Liang, just sitting on top of the city gate, who's just casually jamming music with servants by his side, as if it's Casual Friday or something. So the various generals at the enemy army started suggesting at this point that they can just storm the city and take the easy win. After all, there appear to be no visible defenses. But the leader of the enemy army disagreed. The leader of the enemy army is a man named Sima Yi. He looked at the situation for a bit, thought about it, and said, guys, we need to get the fuck out of here.
Fuck this shit, I'm out.
We need to retreat fast. His subordinates was not understanding this reaction. So they ask, why, bro? It's an easy win, right? There's no defenses, the gate is wide open. Let's just storm the city and take the easy win. So Sima Yi answered, you know, guys, things are not as simple as it seems in this situation. Do we know who we are fighting against? We're fighting against Zhuge Liang, for God's sake, the famous strategist renowned for being incredibly careful and lethal with the way he fights. There's no way that he just opens up the city gate for no reason, knowing full well that we're about to arrive. The Zhuge Liang we know would never do this. If he is leaving the gate wide open, there must be a reason for it, right? He must really want us to go inside the city. The question is why? Why would he want us to do that? Let's look at the geography of what we're dealing with here. We're trying to attack this town. This town is surrounded by mountains, and these mountains have tall trees. It's a lush forest, perfect for hiding soldiers. I think what's happening here is that Zhuge Liang has in fact hidden a bunch of soldiers in these mountains all around us. And he really wants us to go inside the city because the moment we enter, all the soldiers from within these mountains will just storm down at us and kill us all. So this really is a trap that he very cleverly set up, and we are not going to fall for it. In fact, this setup is so dangerous that we must retreat as soon as possible. So let's get the fuck out of here. So the enemy just left at full speed. And Zhuge Liang, upon seeing his trick has worked, swiftly packed up his shit and left as well. Now the news of his retreat eventually arrived at the enemy camp, and Sima Yi was obviously beating himself down for falling for Zhuge Liang's trick, but he couldn't be too mad because it was such a clever use of deception. More fundamentally, this was a play between perception and reality. Specifically, this is where you use your weakness to your advantage. Zhuge Liang in the story had the weaker army. For those who are insecure about their weaknesses, they would rather want to hide it and pretend to be strong, but Zhuge Liang, on the other hand, doubled down on it and exaggerated his weakness instead. He portrayed a front so devoid of military power that it actually implanted an impression of overwhelming strength in his enemy's mind. This is also an example of not just playing the game based on the rules of the game, but also looking at the bigger picture, at the context surrounding the game, and look for things to exploit there. It's an interesting case of thinking outside the box, and in the case of Zhuge Liang, he exploited two elements of the context surrounding the battle. The first is his reputation. He knew that he had a reputation which he built as a result of decades of carefully executed warfare, such that he was known as this formidable, cunning, and cautious strategist all over China. So because he knew that his enemy knew that he was this incredibly formidable and cautious strategist, he could count on the fact that his enemy would assume that he has some hidden tricks, like an ambush planned, because he knew that his enemy wouldn't think that he would do something so reckless as to just leave the city gate wide open without any other plan in mind. If he didn't have this reputation and he was just some nobody,
the fucking nobody?
That fucking nobody.
Jamming music on top of a city gate, when the enemy arrived, they would have just shot an arrow at him and just stormed the city. The second thing that Zhuge Liang knew was his enemy, and he actually customized this strategy specifically for his enemy. He knew that the enemy army was led by Sima Yi, someone he knew to be as cautious and smart as he was, who likes to think things through and as a result have a tendency to overthink, so that Zhuge Liang was able to exploit this tendency to overthink. If the enemy army was instead led by someone else who is more action-oriented, so to speak, someone with a much simpler take on warfare, then this empty fortress strategy would never have worked. Where the enemy would saw the city gate wide open and goes, oh fuck, yes, let's go, and just storm the city. Now this empty fortress strategy actually has lots of different applications in modernity outside the military context. A classical example is fashion. Now you might say, Louis, what do you know about fashion? You've been wearing the same shirt your entire life. But you've got a point there, and I probably don't know anything about fashion, but what I do know is the macro structure governing the dynamics of behavior in fashion that fits this empty fortress strategy quite well. This is a simplified way to look at this, but it's quite illustrative. At the very beginning, we can say that at least some people pursue fashion, which is to say that they want to dress up strategically, that they do so with the intention to gain status. And at the beginning, the way that you gain status with the way you dress is by putting on very expensive and well-made clothing. Let's say a suit that costs $5,000. If you wear a $5,000 suit, you'll feel that you have more status than someone who's wearing a $200 suit. So that's the game as it was being played when it first started. More expensive and well-made and high quality the clothing is, the higher status the wearer of that clothing becomes. And that's all very understandable so far. But then we started to see people wearing things that are quite odd, that doesn't look like it cost a lot of money, and it frankly just looks bad, low quality, shitty clothing, but they are worn by a lot of high status people. And as a result, those clothing becomes trending. And the question is, how did that happen? This is actually an example of empty fortress strategy, because when rich people first started wearing expensive clothing, they were the only one who can acquire those expensive clothing. So them wearing it gives them status. But at some point, anyone with money can just buy these expensive clothing. So how do the ultra rich show that they have more status than other rich people? This is why we see a lot of tech billionaires wear just shitty shorts and shirts, because what they're saying is essentially that they're so rich and so high status that they simply don't care about playing the game anymore. I already own this building in which we're having this conference meeting. I don't need to dress in a $5,000 suit to show up in this meeting. I own the meeting, right? I'm just gonna wear shorts and slippers and a shirt because I'm so high status, right? That's kind of the statement they're making there. They're using their lack of display of wealth and status to conversely convey an overwhelming amount of status. Very similar to how Zhuge Liang used an absence of military power to imply an overwhelming amount of military power. But when the ultra-rich do this, just like the empty fortress strategy, they need to know the enemy or the audience with which they are doing it with. If they're showing up to a board meeting where everyone is relatively wealthy and dressed up in expensive suits, and they just wear slippers and shorts, that makes them look badass and high status. True. But if they go down to Walmart dressed like that, they wouldn't become higher status in Walmart because everyone in Walmart is dressed like that. So when the ultra rich use this fashion strategy, they need to know the audience with which they are doing it with. So that's it. That's the empty fortress strategy. Hope you find that story interesting, and I hope that gave you some inspiration about using it in your own endeavor, ethically, of course. And if you can think of any other examples in modernity in which the empty fortress strategy is used, I'd love to hear them in the comments. And if you like this content and want to know more of what I'm working on, check out my Patreon in the description.